December 29th, 1940. In the dim glow of a desk lamp within the fortified bowels of the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, Winston Churchill sat hunched over a stack of urgent dispatches, his cigar smouldering in an ashtray like a defiant beacon against the encroaching night. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and tobacco, a stark contrast to the chaos raging above ground. Just hours earlier, Luftwaffe bombers had unleashed a firestorm on London, igniting the city in a blaze that consumed historic landmarks like St. Paul's Cathedral's surroundings. Churchill, his face etched with the weight of a nation under siege, paused to scribble a note to his wife Clementine. The flames are visible from miles away, but we endure. In that intimate moment, the Prime Minister wasn't just a leader. He was a man grappling with the raw humanity of war, the terror in children's eyes, the grief of families shattered by rubble, and the unyielding resolve that bound Britain together. As the harshest winter in decades gripped the British Isles, with snow blanketing bomb craters and rationed coal barely staving off the freeze, Adolf Hitler watched from Berlin with cold certainty. He had anticipated this season would fracture the island nation's spirit, following the Luftwaffe's relentless Blitz that began in September. Operation Sea Lion, his planned invasion, had faltered after the Royal Air Force's heroic stand. In the Battle of Britain that summer, where outnumbered Spitfire pilots turned the skies over, Kent and Sussex into graveyards for German aircraft. Yet Hitler pressed on, believing aerial terror would force surrender. By late 1940, over 23,000 civilians lay dead. Cities like Coventry reduced to smoldering ruins in November's infamous raid. The global stakes loomed immense, with France, fallen in June, and the Soviet Union, still neutral under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Britain's isolation meant the free world teetered on the edge. If the United Kingdom buckled, Nazi dominance would sweep Europe unchecked, paving the way for a darker alliance across continents. Churchill, ever the orator, channeled this peril into words that rallied a weary people. In broadcasts from the BBC studios, his gravelly voice pierced the blackout, reminding listeners of their island's storied defiance, from Agincourt to Trafalgar. But as December's bombs fell, the true test unfolded not in grand strategies, but in the quiet acts of survival. ARP wardens pulling survivors from debris, factory workers forging munitions through frostbitten nights, and ordinary Londoners emerging from underground shelters with unbroken humor. Hitler had miscalculated. This winter, meant to break them, was forging an unbreakable will. January 1941, snow lay thick over the scarred streets of London as dawn broke on another frozen morning. In a small terraced house in the East End, a young mother named Elsie Dawson wrapped her two children in threadbare coats and led them down the narrow stairs to the Anderson shelter in the back garden. The night before, the sirens had wailed again. Bombs had fallen close enough to rattle the windows and shower the kitchen with plaster. Yet as Elsie brewed weak tea over a Primus stove in the damp shelter, she hummed an old music hall tune, refusing to let fear silence her. Across the city, thousands of families did the same. Ordinary people turning cramped, icy dugouts into temporary homes, sharing jokes and cigarettes while the world above burned. Hitler's strategy remained merciless. Having failed to gain air superiority in the daylight battles of the previous summer, the Luftwaffe had shifted to night bombing, striking industrial cities and ports to choke Britain's lifeline. Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Plymouth, each endured its own inferno. In January alone, over 200 civilians would lose their lives. The German High Command believed the combination of unrelenting raids and the brutal winter weather would sap morale, cripple production, and force Churchill to the negotiating table. Food rations had already been cut again. Butter, bacon, and sugar were luxuries most could only dream of. Coal shortages meant homes stayed cold, and blackout regulations turned every journey into a perilous stumble through darkness. But something unexpected was happening. Instead of breaking, the British people were hardening. Factory output rose despite the raids. Women like Vera Lynn's fictional Counterparts in Coventry rebuilt. Shattered assembly lines overnight. The Home Guard drilled on frozen fields. Old men and boys clutching rifles with grim determination. And in the skies, RAF night fighters, guided by primitive radar and sheer courage, began to exact a toll on the bombers. Viewfighters and Defiance scored their first successes, proving the darkness could belong to Britain too. Churchill watched these reports with fierce satisfaction. Late one January evening, after another long session in the war rooms, he climbed the stairs to the roof of the annex building. The Thames stretched black below him, searchlights sweeping the clouds like ghostly fingers. He lit a fresh cigar, exhaled slowly, and muttered to an aide, "They thought the winter would finish us. They were wrong." February 6, 1941. The House of Commons chamber was packed, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and the murmur of anxious MPs. Winston Churchill rose slowly from the front bench, his stocky frame casting a long shadow under the dimmed lights. He had come to deliver a statement on the war situation, one that the nation, huddled around wireless sets in cold living rooms and air raid shelters, had been waiting for. For months, the press, and even some in his own party, had whispered that Britain stood alone, starved of hope, with no prospect but endless bombing and slow strangulation. Churchill gripped the dispatch box, paused, and began to speak. His voice, gravel thick and deliberate, filled the chamber and crackled across the airwaves. He spoke first of the suffering, the raids, the rationing, the graves filling too quickly. Then he turned to the winter that was supposed to break them. "We said that nothing the enemy could do with his air force would force us to surrender," he reminded them. "We have been subjected to a strain greater than any other city in the world has ever endured, and we have come through." A ripple of applause broke out, but he pressed on. He described the shipyards working around the clock, the mines yielding coal despite frozen pits, the convoys battling U-boats in the Atlantic to bring food and fuel. He praised the women in the factories, the fire watchers on rooftops, the children evacuated, yet still writing cheerful letters home. Then came the line that would echo through the blackout nights. "This is the time when it is hardest to hold on. But hold on we shall, until the new world comes to the rescue of the old." Across Britain, listeners felt something shift. In a Manchester shelter, a steelworker turned to his mate and said quietly, "He's right, you know. We're still here." In Plymouth, where the docks still smoldered from January's raids, dockers raised a cup of tea to the wireless. Even King George VI, listening in Windsor, reportedly murmured approval. Hitler, reading the intercepted reports in the Wolf's Lair, dismissed it as bluster. But the winter was slipping away, and Britain had not cracked. March 1941, the first faint hints of spring touched the bomb-scarred landscape, crocuses pushing through rubble in London parks, the Thames running a little less sluggishly under lengthening daylight. Yet the Luftwaffe showed no mercy. On the night of March 19th, over 450 bombers struck Plymouth in what the locals would forever call the Blitz's cruelest blow to their city. Fires merged into a single inferno. The medieval heart of the port burned unchecked for hours. By morning, hundreds lay dead, and the naval base Churchill so desperately needed to protect. Atlantic convoys stood battered once more. In Berlin, Hitler's directive remained unchanged: pound Britain until she sued for peace. The Führer had postponed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, partly because he still believed a quick British collapse would free his hands in the East. Intelligence reports assured him that civilian morale was crumbling, that food reserves were perilously low, that U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than the yards could replace them. The winter had been savage. Surely the island could not hold another season of this. But the reports were wrong. In the underground map room at the Cabinet War Rooms, red pins marking sunk convoys still outnumbered the green. Yet the balance was shifting. American Lend-Lease, signed into law on March 11th, promised destroyers food and munitions without immediate payment. Roosevelt's lifeline thrown across an ocean. Hitler could not yet cross. Convoys began escorting ships farther west, and new escort groups hunted wolf packs with growing success. In British factories, production of aircraft, tanks, and guns reached levels that stunned even Churchill's own advisors. Most crucially, the people refused to break. Evacuated children returned to cities because parents missed them. Pubs reopened within days of raids. Football matches drew crowds under the threat of sirens. In Coventry, workers famously cleared debris from a wrecked factory, set up machines in the open air, and resumed production the next morning. Churchill sensed the turning tide. One evening in late March, pacing the garden at Chequers with his private secretary, Jock Colville, he stopped beneath a budding chestnut tree and said quietly, "The worst is behind us. They expected us to crack this winter. Instead, we have grown stronger." April 1941, the Luftwaffe's fury reached its crescendo. On the night of April 16th, more than 680 bombers descended on London in what would become known as the heaviest raid of the entire Blitz for nearly 8 hours. High explosives and thousands of incendiaries rained down. The Thames was so low from an extreme spring tide that fireboats could not reach the blazes along the docks. By dawn, over 1,000 Londoners were dead, and the East End resembled a lunar landscape of craters and twisted girders. St. Paul's stood miraculously intact amid the smoke, its dome a symbol that refused to fall. In the days that followed, the raids continued with unrelenting brutality. Belfast was hammered on April 15th and again on May 4th. Portsmouth, Hull and Glasgow each endured nights that left entire streets erased. Hitler, now finalizing plans for Barbarossa, wanted one last hammer blow to shatter British resistance before turning east. He believed the cumulative toll, over 40,000 dead since September, homes destroyed, sleep stolen night after night, would finally force Churchill to seek terms. Yet in the shelters and rubble-strewn streets, something extraordinary emerged. Grief turned to fury, exhaustion to defiance. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Women in the Auxiliary Territorial Service drove ambulances through burning streets. Firefighters, faces blackened with soot, worked until they dropped. King George and Queen Elizabeth toured the devastated East End, the Queen famously declaring, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Churchill himself walked the ruins the morning after the April 16th raid. Amid the acrid smoke, he stopped to speak with a group of homeless families salvaging possessions from wreckage. One woman, her face streaked with dirt, told him bluntly, "We're not beaten yet." "Mr. Churchill," he nodded, eyes glistening, and replied, "Nor shall we ever be." As April bled into May, the Prime Minister began drafting a speech he knew would define the winter that had failed to break them. The words were forming in his mind, words that would tell the world. Britain had survived its darkest season. May 10, 1941. The wail of air raid sirens pierced the spring. Twilight over London once more. But this night would mark the Blitz's savage finale. Over 500 Luftwaffe bombers, led by pathfinders dropping green flares, hammered the capital in the heaviest raid since April. High explosives cratered Westminster, shattering the chamber of the House of Commons where Churchill had rallied the nation so many times. Fires raged uncontrolled along the Thames, from the Temple to the Abbey, turning the sky blood red. By dawn, more than 2,400 were dead or missing, 2,000 injured, and the heart of government lay in smoking ruin. This was Hitler's parting shot before pivoting east. The last gasp of a campaign meant to raise Britain's will. In the cabinet war rooms, untouched 50 feet below, Churchill emerged ashen-faced from a night of ceaseless reports. Maps showed the devastation, 280 tons of bombs in 7 hours. Yet amid the grief, intelligence whispered relief. The Luftwaffe, bled dry by 9 months of attrition, over 1,000 aircraft lost. Air crews irreplaceable, was withdrawing. Hitler, obsessed with Barbarossa, his colossal gamble against Stalin, set for June 22nd, needed every plane for the Eastern Front. The winter he thought would starve and shatter. Britain had forged steel instead, factories outproducing losses, morale unbowed, convoys slipping U-boat nets with American aid swelling supplies. Churchill toured the wreckage that morning, the sign flashing defiantly to exhausted firefighters and rescuers. To a cluster of shell-shocked survivors near Parliament Square, he paused, cigar clenched, and growled words that captured the miracle of endurance. "We have come through. Hitler thought this winter would break us. He was wrong." Those around him, men and women who had sheltered through 57 straight nights of terror, nodded, tears mixing with soot. The Prime Minister knew the raids might flicker on sporadically, but the worst was past. Now, as whispers of a second front grew, Britain stood ready for whatever fury Hitler unleashed next. May 27, 1941. Amid the gutted shell of the House of Commons, its chamber, reduced to twisted girders and ash-strewn benches by the May 10th raid, Winston Churchill stood in temporary quarters at Church House, Westminster. Temporary wooden desks and chairs had been hastily assembled for this secret session of Parliament, the air still sharp with the tang of charred timber. MPs crammed shoulder to shoulder, faces gaunt from months of strain, eyes fixed on their prime minister as he prepared to deliver what would become one of his most pivotal addresses since becoming leader. The Blitz had exacted its toll, 43,000 civilians dead, 1 million homes shattered, factories pockmarked with craters. Yet here they were, unbroken. Churchill adjusted his notes, lit a cigar, and launched into a review of the war's first year. He recounted the miracle of Dunkirk's 338,000 rescued troops, the RAF's victory in the skies over southern England, claiming 2,698. Luftwaffe aircraft downed against 524. British fighters lost, and the unyielding grip on Malta, that vital Mediterranean outpost. Turning to the winter terror, his voice deepened. All through these dark winter months, the enemy has had the power to drop 3 or 4 tons of bombs upon us for every ton we could send to Germany in return. He evoked the nightly infernos, the frozen shelters, the rationed hearths where families shivered through Hitler's calculated ordeal. Intelligence had painted a grim picture for the Germans, morale fracturing under cold and fire. But Churchill revealed the truth. Production soared, 12,000. Aircraft built in 1940 alone. Ship repairs outpaced sinkings. Even bombed-out Birmingham churned out more shells than before. The chamber hung on his words as he hammered home the defiance. "We have been through an ordeal which no other city in the world has endured," he thundered, praising the firemen who stood amid flames, the housewives queuing in snow for meager rations, the children clutching gas masks with stoic faces. No direct assault on Hitler, but the subtext scorched. "Your winter anvil forged our steel," as he concluded with a vow of relentless counter-offensive. MPs erupted in cheers that echoed through the ruins. Outside, workers sifted debris under a tentative sun, unaware their endurance had just been immortalized. Barbarossa loomed. For Britain, survival was victory's forge. June 1941. Dawn mist clung to the rolling lawns of Chequers, the Prime Minister's country retreat, as Winston Churchill paced the terrace with a fresh cigar, the weight of the winter finally lifting from his broad shoulders. Intelligence summaries lay scattered on a garden table. Confirmed reports of Luftwaffe, squadrons massing eastward, Heinkels, Junkers, Messerschmitts streaming toward Poland and Romania. The Blitz was over. Sporadic raids might still nip at coastal towns, but the nightly armadas that had scarred Britain's cities for 9 merciless months were gone. Hitler's gamble to break the island in its darkest season had failed utterly. In London, the change felt visceral. Blackout curtains came down earlier each evening as days lengthened. Children played in streets no longer expecting the siren's howl. Rubble clearance accelerated, teams of women and pensioners hauling bricks into lorries that would rebuild homes stronger than before. Pubs rang with songs of defiance rather than dread. The BBC broadcast, "Vera Lynn's We'll Meet Again," without the old ache of uncertainty. Rationing remained tight, U-boats still prowled. But the psychological siege had lifted. Britain had endured what no nation before it had. Sustained aerial bombardment on a civilian population meant to force surrender, and it had not surrendered. Churchill gathered his closest advisors that weekend, Anthony Eden, Lord Beaverbrook, General Ismay, and spoke plainly over brandy in the Hawtrey room. Hitler thought hunger and fire would bring us to our knees this winter, he rumbled. He misjudged the British people. He misjudged their king, their parliament, their stubborn refusal to live under the Nazi yoke. The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to listen. Then he added almost to himself, now he turns to Russia. God help them, but God help him more. For he has awakened a sleeping giant in the east while failing to finish us in the west. As the sun climbed higher, Churchill gazed across the Buckinghamshire hills and allowed himself a rare, private smile. The winter meant to destroy them had instead defined them. July 1941. In the sunlit study at Chartwell, his beloved Kent home, Winston Churchill sat alone with a stack of newspapers and intelligence digests. The French windows opened to birdsong that had been absent during the long nights of sirens. For the first time in a year, he could work without the distant crump of bombs. The headlines spoke of distant thunder now, German panzers rolling across the Soviet frontier since June 22, Stuka dive bombers pounding Minsk and Smolensk. Barbarossa had begun, and with it, the Luftwaffe's withdrawal from French airfields became irreversible. Britain's skies were at last her own again. Churchill reflected on the winter that was supposed to have ended it all. Hitler had boasted in Mein Kampf that Britain would collapse under sustained bombing. As weaker nations had, his generals had calculated that 1940-41 shortages, oil, coal, food, combined with nightly terror would force capitulation by spring. Instead, civilian deaths peaked, yet absenteeism in factories fell. Munitions output doubled. The Royal Navy, bolstered by 50 old American destroyers from the Bases for Destroyers deal, turned the Atlantic battle into a grim but winnable slog. Lend-Lease shipments began arriving in volume, promising mountains of spam, aircraft engines and high-octane fuel. Most profound was the change in the national spirit. The shared ordeal had dissolved class barriers. Duchesses and dockers queued together for fish and chips. Lords and labourers swung picks side by side, clearing rubble. The myth of British invincibility, dented by Dunkirk and the fall of France, had been reforged in fire and ice. Churchill's speeches, once dismissed by some as theatrical, now resonated as prophecy fulfilled. He stubbed out his cigar and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. A new broadcast was taking shape, one that would look back on the winter not with bitterness, but with fierce pride. He wanted the world, and especially America, still wavering on the brink of war, to understand what Britain had endured and overcome. The words began to flow, never in the field of human conflict. July 29th, 1941. The BBC's broadcasting house studio was quiet except for the soft hum of equipment as Winston Churchill settled into the chair before the microphone. Outside, a warm summer evening bathed London in golden light. No searchlights, no drones of engines, just the distant laughter of children playing in cleared bomb sites. This broadcast would reach not only Britain but America, Canada, the occupied nations listening in secret, and even neutral ears straining for hope. He had waited until the dust of the Blitz fully settled to speak these words, to let the winter's ordeal crystallize into unbreakable truth. His voice, steady and resonant, filled millions of homes. When I look back upon the winter through which we have passed, he began, the long succession of nights, when London and our great cities were under bombardment, when the enemy thought that by terror from the air he could break our spirit and force us to sue for peace on his terms. I declare to you that never for one moment did that spirit falter. He spoke of the firefighters who held the line against infernos, the mothers who carried on with quiet courage, the factory hands who worked through exhaustion. He spoke of the RAF pilots who had turned the tide the summer before, buying the precious months that allowed Britain to breathe, to build, to endure. Then came the line that would ring through history. Hitler expected to break us in the winter of 1940-41. He failed. He has awakened in the British people a temper and a resolve which will carry us through to victory. Across the nation, listeners sat in silence, many with tears on their cheeks. In pubs, glasses were raised without a word. In shelters now empty of fear, old men nodded knowingly. The winter meant to crush them had instead become their finest hour. Churchill signed off with a promise. The fight would go on, the counterstroke would come, and freedom would prevail. As he left the studio, he paused in the corridor, lit a cigar and murmured to an aide, "We have survived. Now we shall conquer." And in that quiet moment, the island nation that refused to break knew, beyond doubt, that it never would.